did a video the other day, and my statement was that for the next few years we're going to see inflation, and last few years we faced disinflation, and I feel that there's going to be a small disruption in the economy in late 2015, 2016, where you may see a deflationary head fake, which I've talked about. And then if we see someone like a Chris Christie or Rand Paul, they cut taxes, I think it's off to the races when it comes to inflation. But it depends on who's president, what type of fiscal policy is enacted, and then I could have a better feel for what's going to go on. But put that aside for now. And I usually get a lot of not emotional responses, but this is one topic that many people chime in about. They have strong opinions. And I used to argue a lot with people about inflation, deflation. Sometimes I still do, but I try to keep cool on this topic. But I found this one interesting comment, and it's too long for me just to respond to some of these comments. But this is from YouTube user, I'm pronouncing it wrong probably, Benjamin Rocher. Sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong, your name wrong. But anyways, okay, let's look at some of the things that he's saying. They started the printing in 2008, and after all, the more money there is, the more inflation, right? Well, I've been tracking the prices of items for the past few years, and there's been little to no inflation. I simply created a spreadsheet and go to an online grocery store that delivers to my house, and I track basic prices. Why? Because everyone, no matter how sincere, is full of when it comes to inflation. Mainstream media says there's none, while the alternative media screams there is. Okay, time out now. My definition of inflation with many people in the alternative media is the increase in money supply and credit. And the mainstream economists use prices, right? Say, hey, this goes up this amount, or it goes down this amount. That's how they determine inflation or deflation. I think the Austrian way, or the alternative media way of defining inflation, is a bit different than what the mainline economists like a Paul Krugman would state. But now let's get into a few of the items now. The alternative media, when they cite inflation numbers, how when it comes to just an increase in prices or decrease the prices, they look at the inflation or the CPI at how it was calculated back in the 1970s, where inflation was probably 7 to 9%. If they were to use those type of calculations to right now. So that's something to note. So when people say John Williams is full of crap, no, John Williams, what he's doing, he's just taking how they measured the CPI numbers. He was a government employee, right? He calculates the inflation on how it would have been calculated under Volcker. So I don't see why people give him so much slack for calculating inflation to 7 to 9%. I could understand why they criticize him for saying, hey, there was hyperinflation, look, there's no hyperinflation. Okay, that is a legitimate criticism of John Williams, and some of the things that I used to say myself. Okay, fair game there. But now let's get into this inflation deflation argument. And what I've tried to say through all these videos is that the government is doctoring the numbers. There's no doubt in my mind that they're doing that. And let's take a look at some articles I've found out on the New York Post. Okay, this is by John Crudile. I'm pronouncing his name wrong. But this was on March 26, 2014. And a little more about this author, or this journalist. He is also an individual that believes in the plunge protection team is rigging markets on a frequent basis, from what I've read. Okay? And I'm surprised he still works at a big newspaper outlet, right? Because he talks about things that the alternative media talks about, which I still find surprising. He has a post to actually talk about this, or a venue to talk about this. could consider it somewhat mainstream, but regardless, he says Census Office survey scandal grows as inflation stats faked. One of the things that I've been saying is that the government is doctoring the numbers, that the 1% inflation numbers, that's bogus. The Census Bureau's Philadelphia office wasn't just corrupting the nation's unemployment rate by fabricating data. It was also filing false information about inflation in this country. Just how large an effect this fraud was having on the CPI and consequently the cost of living adjustments for Social Security recipients and others is not known yet. Is not yet known. Okay, so that's an important part to know. Some background. Along with its monthly unemployment survey, the Census Bureau conducts thousands of interviews to figure out what Americans are buying. Once census determines purchases, the information is turned over to the Labor Department, which then calculates how much prices have increased. The whole survey is very long, messy, and unpopular, both inside government and outside, and is likely to be changed drastically in the years ahead. Despite that, the CPI is still the sole determinant for retiree and military pay increases, and it is used by the Federal Reserve, companies, and a lot of other organizations that need to determine how fast costs are rising. I began writing about what was happening in the Philly Census office back in November when I learned that a data collector named Julius Bachmann had been caught in 2010 falsifying information that went to the Labor Current Population Survey, which determines the nation's unemployment rate. This individual, however, was also working on the Consumer Expenditure Survey, which goes into the CPI, and he was doing the same thing there that he was with the unemployment survey, making stuff up. In fact, because these surveys are scientifically weighted, Bachmann's fabrication of the labor survey could have given misleading data on around 500,000 families. More background. The Commerce Department seems to have done a cursory review of Bachmann's shoddy work after he was bagged in 2010, but it doesn't appear to have done an official report. It certainly didn't make this transgression public. And Bachmann's case was kept from Congress, even though the census did report to the House committee a similar situation in 2010 that occurred in its Brooklyn office. Why was Bachmann's investigation cut short? It could have been because Bachmann alleged that the higher-ups in Philly told him to fabricate data, and it could have also been because others were doing the same thing. In fact, a source with intimate knowledge of the Philly Census Office says that's exactly what was going on. Data falsification went beyond Bachmann, and this practice continued right up until I broke the story last November, the source says. Okay, so it appears that the higher-ups are telling individuals to falsify data. So if it's happening in Philly, where else is this happening? Knowing that governments are corrupt, and knowing that the government, now the federal government, has an agenda to make sure that, guess what, they don't want to go more into debt to pay military families, so on, and other individuals that are tied to the CPI rate. I mentioned above that there were retiree and military pay increases, right? They're tied to the CPI number. So if you say the CPI is like 1% or something like that, something ridiculously low, guess what? Less money has to be paid out for inflation increases, right? So that's one reason why they want to doctor the numbers. So we have one part of the country that is definitely doctored numbers. Alright, one last thing I wanted to talk about regards to this inflation CPI. It's a good article on the Economic Policy Journal. And this is called Where's Inflation? Dr. Mark Thornton Will Tell You. Yesterday I quoted Murray Rothbard on how economists in the 20s, outside of the Austrian school of course, were caught by surprise by the Great Depression. Here's the Rothbard quote again. The fact that general prices were more or less stable during the 1920s told most economists that there was no inflationary threat, and therefore the events of the Great Depression caught them completely unaware. Rothbard showed that the inflation went to other areas other than CPI prior to 1929, and that's exactly what has happened here since 2009, as I and others thought it would. This individual is correct, and just to embellish more on this very topic, here is Dr. Mark Thornton on a recent episode of the Tom Wiz Show. The government measures inflation with a CPI index, or the CPI, the normal consumption goods that everybody buys on a weekly basis. If we look around at the broader economy, we see tremendously higher prices. We see record highs in the stock market and stock prices. We see all-time prices in the bond markets, whether it's government bonds at an all-time highs or even junk bonds. And so the bond market is in a bubble as well as prices are very high. If you look at real estate market, prices are up across the country. All-time record prices in Manhattan, up over 25% in Florida, Arizona, California, and Nevada. Agricultural land in the Midwest is in all-time highs. The auction market for contemporary art in Manhattan all-time record highs. All the auctions are setting new records despite the increases in supply. Apartments in Manhattan, some of the better neighborhoods, are selling now for close to $100 million each. And that's just the normal condominiums, not for the specialized condominiums by designers. The government measure that CPI index is being held down by the fact that the American public is not doing well at all. They're not getting this free money from the Federal Reserve. They're not getting near zero interest rates. They're not getting loans at all. All that money is going to hedge funds. It's buying up government bonds and things like that. So it makes perfect sense from an Austrian point of view. Alright, so long story short, the CPI, it usually does not do a good job, or it does not do a good job in actually measuring inflation. And I did comment on some of the individuals' comments when it came to inflation. And what I said in regards to Benjamin, if that's how it's pronounced, and I said there's plenty of inflation in the stock market, student loan market, those prices are getting ridiculous, healthcare premiums are getting ridiculous, right? And the list goes on, and not to mention how the government's cooking the books in regards to inflation. I mean, I've stated in other podcasts that the cost, not the cost, but the packaging size of these products are getting smaller. If you look at the P&L, the expenses are getting higher for many of these firms, meaning that they're spending more on the products that they sell to the public. So if you're looking at all these factors, you see inflation on the expense side of the P&L for these companies, you're looking at inflation, student loan market, healthcare premiums, stock markets, bond markets, etc., right? There's plenty of inflation. The only thing is the CPI does not calculate that. But the important part of all of this, if you're trading in the stock market, right, one thing you have to realize is that Wall Street does not give a rat's ass about all of this. They don't care if the government's rigging the markets. All they care about is just making dough. And long story short, I've come to ignore the numbers made by John Williams when it comes to trading, because at the end of the day, Wall Street, they don't really care about that, unfortunately. They buy the BS numbers from the government. So that's how the game is played. So those of you that follow the Austrian school and are participating in the market, you have to remember that you have to go by these BS numbers. That's the really important part. And I know a lot of you tend to follow the Austrian school and don't buy the government numbers, but that's really important. That's the key lesson, though. Anyways, thanks for listening. Talk to you later. Bye.